What is up, everyone? With the recent news that UFC 305 is likely going to be taking place in Perth, Australia, and headlined by Dricus du Plessis defending his title against Israel Adesanya, I wanted to make a video kind of making a dream 305 pay-per-view card. So we're going to have 6 prelim fights, a 5-fight main card. At least one fighter in all of these matchups is going to be either, from or representing New Zealand or Australia. So they're all going to have some connection to the area. Let me know what you guys think about these matchups down below in the comment section, and let's just dive right into it. We're going to be starting off with the prelims. The first fight on the prelims here is going to be Junior Tafa taking on Andrei Arlovski. I've had enough of the Tafa brothers being in these matchups where they're going to get wrestled. No one wants to see a heavyweight matchup with a striker with no takedown defense going up against a grappler. It's just not an entertaining product. It creates a slow, very sluggish fight. So I'm going to have both the Tafa brothers on this card, and they're both going to be fighting guys that are primarily strikers. So for Andrei Arlovski, he has not landed a takedown in his last 15 fights. Both these guys haven't been on the best recent stretch. Junior Tafa's 1-2 in the UFC. Andrei Arlovski's on a 3-fight skid. Obviously, definitely towards the back end of his career. A legend in the sport, but definitely getting up there in age. I just think this fight makes sense. Junior Tafa is a younger guy. It should be a fun striking battle between these two to kick off this card. Then we're going to have Casey O'Neill taking on Luana Carolina. You have to imagine that Casey O'Neill is either going to be on the 304 card, which is likely going to be somewhere in the UK, or on 305 here in Perth, Australia. She's coming off of back-to-back losses. I think she needs to take a step back in competition, and I think Luana Carolina is kind of like the perfect dance partner here. She is coming off of 2 straight wins, including a finish in her most recent fight. So I think this fight makes sense for both these women. Casey O'Neill taking a little bit of a step down, getting a somewhat softer matchup, closer to home, and then Luana Carolina gets that step up in competition after 2 straight wins. We've also seen Luana Carolina be willing to travel to her opponents' home territory. We saw her fight Molly McCann in the UK, so we also have that precedent. Then the next fight on the prelims is going to be Josh Culibao taking on Julio Arce. Both these guys fought very recently, so I think the timeline lines up. Josh Culibao lost a pretty close split decision in March in a fun fight, and then Julio Arce picked up a knockout win in Atlantic City this past weekend. You got to assume Julio Arce stays at 145. He's kind of bounced back and forth between 135 and 145, but he actually missed weight for this most recent 145 fight, so you'd be shocked, right, if he's trying to go now back down to 135. I think he stays at 145, needs to build up some momentum. I think this is a fun striking battle between two dudes that are probably pretty closely aligned skill-wise. And then another fun striking battle up next with Jack Jenkins taking on Melsik Bagdasaryan. Jenkins has made it known that he wants to fight on this card. He's coming off his first UFC loss where he injured his arm. He was pretty much getting taken down, went to post, but he posted with a straight arm. The arm snapped. It was pretty gross, but it seems like he's going to be good to go here for UFC 305. Like I said, 2 very entertaining strikers. Jack Jenkins has some of the best leg kicks in the UFC. He's broken his opponent's legs on multiple different occasions, or at least one of the legs, multiple different fights. Melsik has a super diverse striking game, lots of fun kicks, just an overall fun style. So I think that would be a super exciting fight here on the prelims. The next one is going to be the second Tafa brother, Justin Tafa, taking on Mick Parkin. The older Tafa brother, like I mentioned earlier on, won a striker versus striker matchup. Mick Parkin is capable of mixing in the wrestling, but he's primarily more of a striker. Both these guys actually fought on the same card a few weeks ago. Tafa's coming off a decision loss to Carl Williams, where we saw him get grappled. Mick Parkin's coming off a decision win over Muhammad Usman. So I think this fight makes a lot of sense. Will probably take place on the feet. You'd like it to just be a purely striker versus striker matchup, but you can't rig it completely. And to be honest, there are going to be a lot of fighters who just would want to go take down Tafa. Not necessarily because they don't think they can stand with him, but it's just shown to be the path of least resistance because his takedown defense hasn't been great. But I think, you'd assume this would be at least somewhat taking place on the feet, which is what we want to see out of the Tafa brothers, especially if we are going to Australia. And then the featured prelim, final fight on the prelims here, Brad Riddell taking on Ludovic Klein. This is going to be a 1.5-year layoff for Brad Riddell, or it was going to be a 1.5 year, where he was scheduled to fight Thiago Moises in March. He ended up pulling out of that fight. Looking at Riddell's last 3 losses, lost 3 in a row, but it really has been to just the elite competition. Rafael Fiziev, Jalen Turner, Hanato Moicano. that is a tough, 3 fighters to go up against back to back to back. This is a step back in competition, but it still keeps him in the mix. It's not like he's going from top 10 competition down to like guys making their debut in the UFC. I mean, Ludovic Klein's been on a roll. He's 4-0-1 in his last 5, but he also just has not been facing the level of competition that Brad Riddell has, and I don't think he's beaten anyone on that stretch that is at Brad Riddell's level. So I think this is a fun fight. It's a great featured prelim, and I think it makes sense for both of these dudes. If they wanted to give Brad Riddell a little bit of a softer matchup, I wouldn't hate it, but I do think this would be a really fun fight. Now, pivoting over to the main card, a 5-fight main card here, we are going to start off with Kai Kara-France taking on Manel Kape. If both these guys are healthy, this is 100% the fight to make here in the flyweight division. They were scheduled to fight at UFC 293 in Sydney, Australia. Kai Kara-France had to pull out with a concussion. Kai has not been booked for a fight since, so there's not a ton of clarity on if, that's a lingering problem. Obviously, you don't want to mess around with concussions. Hopefully, he's going to be healthy enough to fight on this card. But if you remember, Kai Kara-France pulled out. Then there was a ton of beef between Manel Kape and his team. He was going after Izzy at the press conference. He was going after their team in the his very memorable post-fight the post-fight interview. And then Kape, since then, has not had a great run. He missed weight for a fight in January. That fight was rescheduled against Mateus Nicolau for a main event in April. He is now pulled out of that one. So not quite sure what the injury is, but hopefully these guys are both healthy enough, 4 or 5 months away for this 305 card, because this would be a very fun fight stylistically, and there's the bad blood. So I think this is the fight to make if they can make it to fight day. In the next matchup, we have Tai Tuivasa taking on Jamal Pogues. It is very clear Tai Tuivasa needs a step back in competition. He needs a fight in front of the fans, and he needs to fight someone who's not going to try to take him down, and is not like the upper echelon of the heavyweight division. He has 4 straight losses by finish. Not a great run. We have not gotten to see a shoey since February of 2022. We need to get right here. We need to see a Tai Tuivasa shoey, at home. Jamal Pogues, it's not like he's a scrub. He's 3-1 in the UFC if you include his Contender Series fight, but he's only landed a takedown in 1 of those 4 fights. All 4 of them went to decision. This is the right fight for Tai Tuivasa against a guy who's not known as a finisher, is probably not going to be able to take him down consistently. This does seem like a get-right fight for Tai, but it also makes sense for Jamal Pogues, who's been pretty successful so far in his UFC career. So I think this is the fight to make for Tuivasa. He needs that step back, get him on the main card, and I think we get a nice show out of Tai for this card if that matchup does come through. Then we're going to have Dan Hooker taking on Beneil Dariush. Now, I will say, I don't think I mentioned at the top, I'm not putting anyone in these fights who's already matched up. So there are definitely people who could win their upcoming fights and then get on this card if they have some connection, but I didn't want to put people on here who were already scheduled because their opponent's going to be so vastly different based on whether they win or lose. Maybe they win or lose, but they suffer a ton of damage. They might not be able to turn around. So I just took anyone off that, already has a fight booked. Off the top of my head, like a Jamie Malarkey, I think is already booked. So guys like that didn't put on this card. And not that either of these guys are booked, but the lightweight division is very jammed up right now, just with a lot of fighters scheduled for fights. So Oliveira, Gaethje, Sarukian, Turner, Moicano, Green, Jim Miller, all those dudes are booked. And so this matchup could change, right, depending on the results of those fights. UFC 300, like a little over a week away. Who knows how those shake out? One of those guys could be Dan Hooker's next opponent. But right now, I think this fight makes sense if, none of those dudes are able to turn around. Dan Hooker's coming off of 2 wins. Dariush is coming off of 2 losses. Hooker deserves an opportunity to fight up. Beneil, I think, should be fighting back at this point. So I think it's a fun matchup, if nothing else kind of presents itself with some of these upcoming lightweight fights. And then shifting into the co-main event, this is a fantastic co-main event if it comes through, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Jack Della Maddalena taking out Shavkat Rakhmonov. Leon Bilal will likely be taking place at UFC 304 a month before this in the UK. This is the perfect opportunity to have a number 1 contender fight. JDM is 7-0 in the UFC. He's coming off a knockout win over Gilbert Burns, a great comeback performance. Shavkat is 6-0, coming off a submission win over Wonderboy. So both guys coming off of strong performances. Both also coming off of injuries, but this timeline seems reasonable. I know JDM's talked about how he could likely make this turnaround, and Shavkat fought at least a few months before JDM, so I think the timeline could make sense. This is the fight to make for the number 1 contender spot. If they don't want to make this fight and they just want to keep contenders, I get it. But if you do really want to find that number one contender, this is the fight to make. I think it's super fun stylistically. You have JDM's connection to Australia. I think that fight makes a ton of sense to put together. And then the main event, no surprise here, said it at the top, Dricus du Plessis defending his title against Israel Adesanya. Aside from the fact that I firmly believe this fight should be taking place in Africa, outside of that, this is just a really strong matchup here. I know there's going to be some controversy of, does Israel Adesanya deserve the title shot? You could probably argue no. A lot of people want the Sean Strickland rematch. And, like, to be honest, I don't know if either are really deserving of the title shot here. We're kind of in this weird spot where there's not, like, a clear top contender. This is probably the best seller just based on the beef these guys have. Israel Adesanya is obviously a star. DDP and Strickland had a super close title fight, but there's not a ton of precedent for a dude with 0 title defenses getting an immediate rematch. So, like, I don't think they could have gone wrong with the Strickland rematch, but I also don't think it's crazy to have the Adesanya fight, especially with the build-up they have. You do want to capitalize on it. Now, I do think they should have capitalized it in Africa, which is kind of where this beef kind of stemmed from, but whatever. It's fine. There's true bad blood between these two dudes. DDP has looked so much better over his last 2 fights. What version of Adesanya are we going to get? The version against Strickland was something we really hadn't seen before. You know, we had the Pajeda loss, but he was looking pretty good in that fight up until getting knocked out. The Strickland fight, I mean, he was just pretty much dominated across 4 of the 5 rounds. So I think this is a super strong main event. Overall, I think they can put together a really nice card here for UFC 305. So how are you guys feeling about these matchups? I think if this fight card comes through, it would be very solid. Great main event, great co-main. I think the rest of the fights on the main card make a lot of sense. And then some fun prelim matchups also. So let me know your guys' thoughts. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.